Okay, so my name is Ella. I'm at the University of Waterloo. I'm going to be talking to you a little bit. I'm going in a completely different direction. So I'm going to be talking about sea otter return. This is part of the sea otter return to Haida-Gwaii project, which is done in partnership with Parks Canada and the Council of the Haida Nation. There were over 45 different collaborators, and this was part of my PhD. I lived out on Haida-Gwaii, and essentially we were looking at sea otter return and trying to understand how to understand it from in ways that local people would sort of best be able to understand and work with scenarios. And part of the reason for this is that often formal diagrams and models can be really confusing when you're working with local people and trying to gain governance insight. So we really wanted, because Haida-Gwaii is an island, it's very specific, it's got a very unique environment, we really wanted to look at scenarios as a different way to do things. And so my idea of scenarios is a little bit different to probably the idea of most people's scenarios in the room. We were thinking about visual scenarios, and we were also thinking about narrative scenarios. And so part of my PhD was really thinking about scenarios as plausible examples of what could happen under particular assumptions and conditions. And we really wanted to use them as a tool to sort of try and understand this complex system in which sea otter return could exist. So we were using both visual and narrative scenarios. And this is particularly important because in Haida-Gwaii, people tend to engage with things in a more visual manner, and everything there is done on an oral history basis. So having something that was both oral as well as visual was really, really important, and something that we felt would be really great to take out to the community that we're working with. So I'm jumping along, but we wanted to try and co-produce the scenarios. So we walked into the room with a blank slate, and we figured out a group of people that would be best positioned to try and create these scenarios together. So the community helped us select a group of elders, archaeologists, people who were working in marine spatial planning. We also had a sea otter expert who actually came and attended the meeting in person, Tim Tinker, who has worked in sea otters basically around the world as an ecologist. And we also had some youth. And so together we all met in person. Each of these meetings would happen for about 3 hours. And we sat down and we talked about place, what places are important, why are they important. We wanted to make sure that we had a diversity of different habitats represented, because different habitats have different species in them. And so we sat down and we sort of discussed, what information there was available. We looked at oral history texts. We looked at the Haida Traditional Marine Knowledge Study, which had gone around and interviewed people around the island. I think I also read everything that has ever been written about sea otters. And so every single week we would come and we would build these images and these stories together. And then we also talked about, well, what kind of questions do we want to get out of the community? What kind of governance questions are going to be important and help us to sort of understand how we might go about managing sea otters? And what was really important was often, when we took information from the community, it would be the relationship between kelp and sea otter, or shellfish and sea otter. And so what we were trying to do is we were trying to put this into one kind of really big image so that we could take it out to people and we could engage with them to get governance insights, so how they might want to see management going forward. So this is kind of how it ended up looking. So together the group wanted to pick, so there are two main communities, the one is based here, the other one's based here. We wanted areas that at least people were familiar with. So we picked one area which is down in the Marine Reserve, which is called Kungut Island. We picked one up here, which is sort of a muddy estuarine area. This is more rocky reef. And then we picked a rocky reef that is actually closer to humans. Up here is the community of Massa, and then we also picked a beach. So we have these different environments. I know that for the sake of time, I can't go into all the environments, but what I'm going to do is I'll give you an example of how this might have looked. So I'm going to jump into Kungut Island, which is all the way down in the south. And so what we did is based on the information that we had at the time, and we were working with the Council of the Haida Nation and Parks Canada as well. So it's not super clear, I'm afraid, but we basically, I mean, the visual isn't super clear. It's super clear when you see it blown up on a big screen. So we would give it, so what we have is how it looks at the moment down by Kungut Island, and then how it might look with sea otter return, sea otter establishment. And you can see at the moment, there's this sea otters have been extirpated from this area because of the fur trade. So they've been absent from the system for more than 200 years at this point. And so we've seen this increase in herbivores, and they've really kind of gone in and decimated the kelp forest. So we actually have a problem down there, which is involving zombie urchins, which are urchins that essentially just feed along the kelp line. And they're healthy, and then all the rest of the urchins actually aren't healthy. They don't have roe inside of them. It's a major issue down in the south. And so we kind of were trying to illustrate with this particular scenario what might happen with sea otter return. So much less shellfish and invertebrates, but in turn there's an effect. So early on you got introduced to the idea of trophic cascades. So we see a sort of a trophic cascade happen here. We see rockfish increase by 46 times. We see that it provides a nursery for a variety of species. Cod use it as protection. And so we would we showed this image to a group of, we had 3 different focus groups, and we'd show this image to the focus groups, and we'd really get feedback from community members as to how they felt about each of these 4 images, and then kind of governance insights that arose from that. So we had one group which co-created the images, and then another group which would then use these images. We would take them out to them and sort of discuss governance insights that came from this. And I'm just going to quickly, I won't talk too much, but each image was done with my Haida partner reading out the story, and each one has a slightly different story. So this one, for example, there are some positives in the sense that seagrass or eelgrass actually does a lot better with sea otter return, but you do see a reduction in a lot of shellfish, which are important to people for food security. So when we show this image, we would get stories from the community about food security and their different concerns. Each of the images also has a different story in terms of otter behavior and how it changes from place to place. So for example, somewhere like in the north, up in Yan, you would see sea otters really staying within a 5-kilometer radius. You would see mums and pups. And so each of these stories would kind of illustrate how change would happen in that area. And I'm just going to jump over to the last image, which is sort of a slightly more negative one in North Beach. I'll mention this image very briefly because something that was interesting was as we were co-creating these images and trying to understand what would happen in different parts, something that came up in North Beach was that because of the area and where it's situated, sea otters would probably only access it seasonally. So it's somewhere where there's not a lot of kelp nearby. So it's really an area where you would get non-territorial male otters coming in and out. So some of the insights that we got when we shared this sort of information was feedback around, well, historically there was hunting in the area. Would this be an area where we might want to hunt them, given that they would be mainly predating on Dungeness crab and lots of shellfish? And this is actually a really important area to the community for harvesting. So each of these images showed completely different relationships, but we got really interesting feedback and insight from community members. So some of our key insights was really because we've co-developed these future scenarios, people really engaged with them and they really trusted them because they knew the people that had been part of it. These scenarios also showed things very accurately. So whereas before when we worked with community members and we showed them models, they sort of struggled to grasp some of the things, but when it was shown together in an image, it was much more accessible. And so we got really interesting insights and we ended up actually getting quite specific management approaches. So specific, very sort of fine spatial scale suggestions as to how governance might be happen in the area and how this might be managed. I know that I'm running low on time, so I think one of the really interesting things that came up out of this is that when you sort of have these really co-produced and place-based insights on how sea otter return might happen, it's very, very different to how things are being managed at the moment. So for example, the Species at Risk Act really looks at things from a conservation perspective, and it sort of keeps it at a very narrow level. Whereas when we spoke to community members, they were thinking about it, not just in terms of conservation, but also in terms of sort of Haida-led research and what might happen in the future, linking that to cultural revitalization, thinking about food security, how sea otter return might affect them in terms of different species that they could access, how that would change on very specific points on the island. And I guess this is the question. So I was part of a big modeling group, and the big question that sort of came up was, when you have this very sort of fine grain information, like how do you really take these perspectives and integrate those into a formal model? Because going forward, these insights are all being used by the Council of the Haida Nation and Parks Canada to try and figure out how to manage sea otter return, which is happening naturally on Haida-Gwaii. It's already been happening since 2009, and so we're starting to see them come back. And one of the things which the modelers are sort of grappling with at the moment is, well, to what extent can models sort of show this relational complexity? So those are kind of my questions that I have as I wrap up this work. And I realized I just summarized like 3 years of living on an island and all this work into 15 minutes. So I hope it made sense. And yeah, thanks for your time.